Have you noticed that the price of your groceries has gone up? Bread, milk, cheese, eggs are all more expensive, and it's something we're seeing throughout most of the globe. So what is behind the price increase?
The price of food has gone up every single month for the past year, and according to experts, food prices will increase to a whopping 7% by the end of 2022. Since 2021, food prices in Egypt have increased by up to 30%. The current inflation rate is 12%, and its food reserve is only enough to last 6 months. Tunisia's food price has increased to 54%. The current inflation rate is 7%, and the country has zero food reserves. Pakistan's food prices rose by 30%. Its inflation rate is 13%, and its food reserve is unknown. While the food crisis has been an official global issue since 2008, hitting countries such as Yemen, Nigeria, and Ethiopia particularly hard, the situation has gone from bad to chaotic ever since the Russia-Ukraine war kicked off. This conflict has led to food shortages and skyrocketing prices in several countries, contributing to the ongoing worldwide food calamity. But how exactly is the Russia-Ukraine war causing a global food crisis? And why are countries that were previously unaffected suddenly experiencing food shortages and inflation? Today, we'll take a closer look at the causes and impacts of this crisis, so be sure to stick around. Before the war started, numerous countries across the globe were already facing a food problem. China experienced massive floods in 2021 that destroyed 30 million acres of its farmlands. Drought in the United States and Eastern Africa were seriously affecting their agricultural sectors. The World Food Program, or WFP, has stated that it is trying desperately to hold back famine in 5 countries, namely Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Yemen, Somalia, and South Sudan. Civil wars in the likes of Syria and Yemen hampered their people's ability to secure food, while the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan led to Western financial sanctions that affected the country's food security. There was also the nuke-like explosion of a port warehouse in Beirut, Lebanon in 2020, one of the worst in history, that obliterated many of the country's grain silos and forced Lebanon to rely on grain shipments from other places for their food supply. And of course, there was COVID-19, which caused shipping restrictions that also slowed down the supply of food between nations. By the end of 2021, world hunger had increased by 25%, with 193 million people across 53 countries suffering from food scarcity. One of the countries that many other regions rely on for their food supply is Ukraine. The country was a top source of grain for the European market. Exporting around 20 million tons of grain a year, it was the second largest exporter after the United States. Countries all over the world looked to Ukraine for its high-quality corn, wheat, and barley. However, everything changed when the war began. With the conflict raging on, Ukraine's top export has quickly become its own citizens. Hundreds of thousands have fled the country to escape the violence, leaving millions that remain on an unstable footing. Because of this war, food shortage, inflation, and rising prices have become major problems, not just in Europe, but also around the world. Wheat, barley, and corn exports from Ukraine have dropped significantly as a result. Before we dig into the details of the war, let's briefly discuss how the two nations got here in the first place. Apparently, Russia and Ukraine have been embroiled in conflict ever since 2014, when Russian troops invaded Crimea due to a political uprising that threatened Moscow's influence there. Although this didn't escalate to an official war, the tension between the two countries remained high.
It was unprovoked, but this is what Russian President Vladimir Putin unleashed on Ukraine.
On the morning of February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin sent out Russian troops to Ukraine once more, with the goal of demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine. His stated mission was to defend those who claimed to have been subjected to 8 years of bullying and genocide by the Ukrainian government.
Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима.
However, it was framed as an attempt to stop NATO from expanding and including Ukraine in their alliance. Russia views this as an existential threat since the fall of the Soviet Union. Ukraine quickly fell to the Russian forces, leaving most of the country under their control. While this might not have sounded like the start of a food crisis at first, it actually was, and here's how. Both Russia and Ukraine are one of the world's largest producers and exporters of wheat, corn, sunflower oil, barley, and fertilizer. Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe for specific reasons. The country is home to a vast network of fertile land, which are perfect for growing crops. The European Commission estimates that Ukraine makes up 10% of the global wheat market, 13% of the barley market, and 15% of the corn market. On top of this, Ukraine produces 1/3 of the world's sunflower and around 76,000 tons of honey each year. The country's agricultural exports totaled $27.8 billion in 2021, making up 41% of the nation's $68 billion in total exports. Typically, Ukraine exports more than 2/3 of its production to countries like Italy, Russia, Germany, India, and many others. Russia, on the other hand, is the world's largest wheat exporter, primarily to the Middle East and Africa. Sunflower oil, which accounts for 28.6% of global exports, barley up to 15.4%, and corn about 2.3% are also important exports for Russia. Their total exports amount to $37.1 billion in 2021, which was 21% higher than their production in 2020. Around 12% of the world's calories come from both of these countries. Bread, cakes, cookies, pastas, and noodles need wheat as a key ingredient. A drop in the production of these crops will result in skyrocketing prices, but not just for these products, but also for countless other foods that contain them as an ingredient. In addition to this, both countries also produce large quantities of barley and corn, two important ingredients for animal feed. A sudden reduction in their production of them will result in higher prices for meat, chicken, and dairy products as well. Because Ukraine and Russia are busy fighting each other, neither one is able to adequately tend to their farms and fields. As a result, these crops are suffering, and production has decreased significantly. This reduction in food supply will cause serious problems for the country that rely on them to feed themselves and their livestock. Farmers in Ukraine have now turned to soldiers. Instead of growing food, they are planting landmines and other explosives in the fields to deter Russian forces from approaching. Farming lands in Ukraine are now also being used as military bases by Russian troops, and some of these fields have been damaged and destroyed in the fighting. Because farmers are now being deployed as soldiers and some of the farmlands have been used for military purposes, producing the standard amount of food is nearly impossible. The current food production in Ukraine is not close to the estimated production levels it had in the past. In fact, estimates by the local agriculture company suggest that Ukraine's early grain harvest for 2023 is unlikely to go past 2 million tons. It will drop by at least 50% compared to 2022. And even if these farmers are able to plant, grow, and harvest their crops, there are still silos filled with wheat, corn, and other crops from the last harvest, and most are starting to go bad already. Over 10 million tons of supposed to be exported crops are in storage across the country, leaving the new batch of harvest without storage. But why can't Ukraine just send these last batches of crops to other countries? The problem is that the Russian military has blocked off the main port of Odessa, where most of the exports leave, and they're not letting anything get in or get out of Ukraine. Since the Ukrainians are fearful of a possible Russian invasion via beaches and coastline, they have also planted naval mines within Odessa's waters to deter any ships from entering. Combining both of these, it's clear why Ukraine can't export its crops anytime soon. Because the breadbasket of Europe is in a war zone, other countries are now starting to experience a real shortage of food. With food shortage and high off-the-chart food prices, many people turn to planting their own crops and growing their own food. However, there's one problem. Russia is a large exporter of fertilizers, which is important for the growth of crops. Since Russia is too occupied with the ongoing war, the production of fertilizers isn't being met. This leads to a skyrocket in prices for fertilizers and in turn a reduction in crop production. Farmers in Kenya who solely relied on Russian fertilizers have already seen a drop in their harvests. Those who think they could buy their fertilizers from other countries are also finding the prices too expensive. Because of what Russia has done, many countries have sanctioned Russia. Wheat, corn, and barley imports from Russia have been blocked, and many food companies are scrambling to find alternative sources of these vital ingredients. Many people from the USA and Europe may not be able to directly feel the full effects of a global food crisis, since both can afford to import food. However, developing nations such as Kenya, South Sudan, and Madagascar are among those who have been hit hardest because they rely on imports from Russia and Ukraine for their daily food supply. The change in supply caused by the blockade of Ukrainian exports, combined with the already existing record prices for energy and basic commodities, prompted several nations to impose export restrictions. This has fueled market shocks and uncertain operations and caused the global food supply to be unpredictable. While places like the USA and Europe are looking for new sources of food, others are trying to aid communities in Ukraine that have been most severely impacted by the ongoing conflict. Charities, NGOs, and even international organizations such as the UN are providing resources to help farmers replant and stabilize their agricultural supply chain so they can continue to feed millions of people. In all the mess, fear, and chaos of the Russia-Ukraine war, one country has seen an opportunity that's too good to pass up, and that country is China. As a way to expand its power and influence, take control of administrations, and weaken its rivals, China is trying to present itself as another aiding country, but in reality, it is trying to take advantage of the dire situation. How so? Well, China has been secretly stockpiling food and supplies for years. The country has 150% of their annual food consumption stored somewhere within the country, which is a huge amount considering how densely populated the region is. While everyone was busy with the crisis, China was occupied with amassing as large a stockpile of food, supplies, and resources as possible. If the world suddenly stopped producing food, China would have enough to survive for 1.5 years. Compare that to the US, who doesn't have enough to last them a half year despite its population being 4 times smaller than China. When push comes to shove, China will sell these resources at exorbitant prices to other nations, including the US and Europe. They're in a diplomatic position to trade food with other countries. In exchange for food, they will have the power to demand resources and even land. And unless the rest of the world comes together to resolve the worsening hunger crisis, China can capitalize on its food supply to turn itself into the world's leading superpower. The Russian-Ukraine war has indeed caused a global crisis, with many countries impacted by the blockades imposed by Russia, the inability of Ukraine to produce crops, and fluctuations in food prices due to changes in supply. The economic impact has been far-reaching, and many countries are seeking to diversify their markets in order to get around the restrictions placed on Ukraine and other affected nations. For the time being, however, it seems that the crisis is set to continue for some time. What do you think should be done to help resolve the current global food crisis? Are we doing enough to support countries that have been most severely impacted by this conflict, or do we need to be doing more? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel.